Welcome everyone. I'm Jes Gorter. I'm a technology officer at Rubicon, at the cloud consultancy firm specialized at Microsoft. Today we're going to talk about deploying Power BI automatically and why would you want to do that, and I'm also going to show it. I recently gave this talk at a Power BI user group in the Netherlands, and I thought it would be fun to share this with you. So what is the problem we're trying to solve? Well, for example, when you're a data engineer or a data architect, my job is to design and implement data platforms. A data platform is not just a data warehouse, right? It's not just one part of the solution. For me, the data platform is the whole package, from ingestion of sources to data models eventually presented to the client. And maybe you could even say that reports on that data platform are also part of the platform, but that's not really important for now for the whole definition. But I'm trying to say that you're delivering a whole package. You're not just presenting a data warehouse. Data models in Power BI, for me, are also part of a data platform. Think about if you go back in time, what did we used to have? We used to have analysis services on premise, and a cube would definitely be part of the whole data warehousing solution, right? You would have a data model with dimensions, facts, measures, calculations, and the BI developer would present this so that end users would have an easy model to work with and they would interact with that model. And I think there's already a sort of paradigm shift in thinking between some people, especially when you say, I use Power BI, I'm a Power BI architect or developer. They usually think you're just opening Power BI desktop and creating little reports for clients, just a front-end job. Whereas I think, and this session is a little bit about that the whole cube development has moved to Power BI. And because of that, it's part of the data platform. And that's where we're going to focus on today. So what do I want? I want the release of my data platform to be based on DevOps. I want to have, for example, all my code in Azure DevOps. I want people to be able to see what changed, when deployment was successful, who changed what. For example, maybe someone changed the DAX formula and now the calculation of profit is wrong and we made some bad decisions on that. I would like to see who changed it, when and why. And those kind of things are very normal for back-end development, right? For data warehousing. But it's not so common for Power BI. And that's a thing that we want to solve. So we want to have a whole data platform from A to Z, and it all needs to be professionally aligned. It all needs to be deployed in one pipeline. And it's important that I can deploy it with a single click on a button. So I want to have code review in case you make a mistake, and I also want to have source control to go back to an earlier version if that's applicable, right? So if it's needed, I want to be able to go back. It's a very normal thing for data warehousing, and I think why not for Power BI? And that was the problem I wanted to solve. So how do we do this with Power BI? Well, Power BI is seen as a self-service BI tool. It's also how Microsoft positions it in the marketplace, right? So end users can just create their own BI solution from ETL, ingestion, transformations, creating a model, making relationships between one table and the other table, and eventually you create a report. So it's the whole package, like a Swiss Army knife for your data platform. Only it's also interesting to be part of a whole data platform. That's I can already tell you that, let's say, a big organization wants to create a big data platform. They're not just using Power BI, because for self-service, it's more or less a smaller scope, right? So it's not really meant to be a whole data platform in a single solution. It's actually meant as a self-service BI tool. So for example, some of our finance wants to create a simple report. They can ingest some data, do some ETL, create a model, and then present it to a user. But if you want to say, I want to create a whole data model for a whole organization, it's not a whole data warehousing data platform solution. That's a big distinction to make. And there's some confusion in this, right? So if, for example, an organization asks for a Power BI consultant, what does it even mean? Do you create reports, or are you really focusing on using the Power BI REST API? Are you working with source control? So those lines between professional BI developer and self-service developer are blurring a little bit. And that's where some confusion comes from. Well, I'm talking about, let's say you're a BI professional, you're a data engineer, data architect. How can I professionally use Power BI and deploy those models the same way I would the rest of my data platform? So what is the problem with Power BI? It's eventually either a PBIT file or a PBIX file. One is a Power BI template file, the other one is a report. And those are just zip files, right? Which means that if you use them as source control, you cannot really see the difference because it's a zip file. It's not data that you can read. It's compressed. It's not readable JSON or XML kind of data that you can just open and just view what's in there. So if you're using source control, that's already a little problem, right? So I cannot really see who changed what in my PBIX file or who changed what in my Power BI template file. So that's already the first problem we're having here. So you don't really have an easy version of, you don't really have an easy form of source control either. So that's what the first problem that was that I encountered when I was trying to look at Power BI and see how can we use this in a professional development setting. So how do we used to do things? Well, on the left side you see Azure, which has automatic deployment, DevOps, Git, and that's source control. So you see a data lake which has several layers, right? So you have a raw layer, a structured layer, a curated layer. Could also be bronze, silver, gold if you prefer that kind of architecture. Basically the same thing but different names. One is the Databricks name and the other one is, I think, Microsoft name, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, so that is all managed part of the solution. And then you have, how do we used to do things? We used to have Azure Analysis Services on the far right of the data platform. So we say, all right, Analysis Services, it's part of Azure, it's part of Visual Studio. I can deploy, if I have an Analysis Services model, it's JSON. I can read it, I can see what's different. I can deploy it easily with PowerShell or with, and it all just works. It's proven technology, it has been around since, I'm not even quite sure when it was around, I think around 2005-ish. Okay, so it was an older version, right? It was multi-dimensional, an older version. Now we have the tabular form. And Power BI is basically based on the tabular version of Analysis Services. But how do we used to do things? I'm talking about, let's say, 2 years ago. We would more or less manually deploy Power BI files. Sure, there are probably some people who already had pipelines in PowerShell and whatever they have already built. But how I used to do things, let's make it my thing. In my experience, I was manually deploying those things. And if I had to change, for example, the server from development to test and then bring it to a different workspace. But the whole Power BI side of things was a manual deployment thing. And that's not what we really would like. So let's talk about Azure Analysis Services. Well, technology around since 2000-ish, but then it was just on-premise, SQL Server Analysis Services. It's also what Power BI's own data model is based on. So under the hood, if you open Power BI Desktop, it's actually Analysis Services. You can actually connect to it as well if you would like. There's a lot of knowledge about this topic. There's a lot of in the community because it's been around for so long. The tabular model version is from 2012, SQL Server 2012. So now it's scalable on the cloud, right? So it's an easy way to say, well, why don't we use that? Why don't we just use Azure Analysis Services and deploy JSON models to that? Because Analysis Services data model is JSON. It's readable. I can open it. I can see who changed what. So all those problems I talked about earlier are more or less solved when you use Analysis Services, which is the reason why in the past I would advise clients to use Analysis Services for professional development. Because you have source control, you have code review, it's scalable. You have one single model and you have multiple reports that you can deliver from it. So it was actually a no-brainer. You're going to build a data warehouse somewhere, you're going to build a data platform, and you're going to use Power BI, create a cube, create a tabular model. It was a no-brainer. Did we even consider as a BI consultant to create a data model in Power BI alone? Not really. You couldn't, at some time you couldn't base multiple reports on it. And there was no code review. There was just no way to do it. So we said that's not really for professional development. So if you look at Microsoft and what they said about Power BI Premium, I think this blog post was from 1.5 years ago, I think, or something. They talked about Power BI Premium, and they said, well, basically, if you look at the future roadmap for analysis services, this is the way to go. So it's going to, Azure Analysis Services will continue to exist. It's not deprecated or anything, but you can now also host analysis services models in Power BI Premium. But they have more options, more possibilities, and it's always the latest compatibility version. So if you deploy your model to Power BI Premium, you have the latest version of analysis services, while Azure Analysis Services is actually a version behind. And you even see that in the features. So Microsoft basically said, choose Premium because we're going to keep on developing this, we're going to keep on investing in this, and Azure Analysis Services will be a subset of that. Quite comparable to when, let's say, a couple years back, when you had the discussion multidimensional model or tabular, where I already said, well, it's a strategic choice to go for tabular, and some ex-colleagues of mine said, for example, well, Jesse, I have a lot more features in multidimensional, shouldn't I just use that? And I said, well, and it still exists today, right? But if you want to use it in the cloud, it's not possible. There's no Azure Analysis Services for a multidimensional model, for example. So Premium is the strategic choice to go for. It will be at the forefront of investments. It will be the front runner for analysis services, so to speak. So it will be interesting to choose Premium and then see if you can deploy everything automatically. So what do we want? What we would like is a data platform that's not just running in Azure, but also in Power BI. So how can we do this? For example, you have now on the right side, well, let's say first on the left side, we don't have analysis services anymore. We have Power BI, we ended the data mart. And at the right hand side, you see Power BI, but within Power BI, I would strongly advise to have certain workspaces that are also part of the data platform, which means they're in premium capacity or premium per user, both are fine. And within those workspaces, you host analysis services models that are deployed automatically from your DevOps pipeline. In this way, you're using the latest feature from Premium, and you have the Premium features such as paginated reports, AI possibilities, which I talked about. It was a Dutch video, but I talked about it in a previous video. And you have the possibility to host analysis services models directly in Premium. So how is this possible? It's possible because we have the XMLA endpoint. If you have Premium, you can actually talk to Power BI workspaces as if they are an analysis services endpoint. So you can talk the XMLA language against it, which stands for XML for analysis services. But funnily enough, a couple of years ago, they switched that to JSON. So you can talk JSON to it, a certain language where you can give certain commands, for example, like refresh your data or deploy this model or delete this model, add this user. And we can just talk programmatically against it, which is interesting because if we do it that way, we can actually also refresh a model much more times than 48 times a day. You can do it as often as you like. And it's possible to deploy things automatically with PowerShell because you can just use those XML endpoints to deploy Azure Analysis Services models to it. So we can actually also develop models with Visual Studio, for example, create analysis services projects and deploy them to Premium. So now the choice now is what do we use, right? Do we want to use Visual Studio, which can create analysis services projects, and you can deploy them to Premium. The only difference is that instead of an Azure Analysis Services endpoint, you just choose that Power BI Premium endpoint. Or you can use Power BI Desktop, which result in zip files, right? The pbit file or the pbix, which are zip files, not JSON models. So, but Power BI Desktop, the advantage here is that it has all the features, right? So if you want to use, for example, automatic aggregations, hybrid tables, incremental refresh, you have to use Power BI Desktop. So now there's the second problem. I want to be able to use all the latest features, but I still want to have an XMLA analysis services model, which I can check into source control and actually see what was changed. So the funny thing is that I found a way to do just that. So what did I want? I wanted to work with XMLA, JSON, and also have the features that Power BI Desktop has. And I found a way, and I will show you how. So let's get to the demo. Like I said, I would like to develop my data model separately from the reports. And I like to do this with a pbit file, which is a template file. This means that there is no data included in the model. So when you upload it to Azure DevOps, there's no data going to the cloud. Well, I'm not against going to the cloud with your data, but I don't think Azure DevOps is really a place where you should upload data to. It's more for code. So let's open a template file that I created for AdventureWorks AW, which is the Microsoft test dataset. And what I'm going to show you is how to develop a data model and use Power BI Desktop. So you have all the latest features, but how you can still use XMLA, JSON data model, how you can create it so that you can still see what kind of changes were published to DevOps. So if you create a pull request, anyone in your team can see what was changed, by who, and why this was done. And I think this is a very important step for transparency, which was something that I always thought Power BI was lacking. So on the one hand, we have Visual Studio, where it was very obvious that you can do it, right? You can create analysis services models, which are JSON, which are XMLA. And with Power BI Desktop, how can you work with Power BI Desktop and how can you still create those kind of models? So I opened the template. You will see it's now called Untitled, but I have my data model. It's AdventureWorks, a couple of tables, not all of them, but just a small couple, the sales, fact table, products, date, and customers. And let's change something to the model. For example, a couple of measures, amount of blue products, amount of red products, and I want to make a change to the data model and then publish this, deploy this to the cloud. So I can just simply create a new measure based on the previous one. For example, amount of black products. Let's add that to the model. And then I'll walk you through the whole process of how you can deploy this change and how you can deploy it automatically using PowerShell. So no manual deployment, not publishing it directly, just all automatically. All right, so this is a new measure, should work. Let's see if it does work. So yeah, it shows me the amount of black products is 133. All right, I don't really want to create a report in my data model file. I like to keep it separate so that you can create a data model separately from all the reports. I think this is a best practice because then you have it doesn't go, it's not dependent on a report. A report should not, in my opinion, have its own data model when you're developing professionally. All right, so this is the change. I'm happy with it. Let's save it once again as a template. Power BI template file, very important to save it as that because otherwise this data is going to go to DevOps. I don't want that. So let's save it. But now I still have just a pbit file, which underwater is actually a zip file. And if I now publish this to the cloud, to DevOps, it will not be very visible what has changed actually. So we are going to need to save it to an XMLA file, which, like I said before, is actually JSON. And let's see how to do this. We can do it with the ALM toolkit. The ALM toolkit is an external software. So let's compare the current model that I have in Power BI Desktop with my data model in Power BI. you'll see I have this workspace called ZZOT. I always use that kind of prefix when it's development or when it's not production. So the production workspace will be called AW, and this is a development workspace. I like to have all my development workspaces in the bottom of the list. So since in Power BI it is sorted alphabetically, I always use this prefix. So let's compare, see what has changed. And so there's a lot of things that says same definition. I usually select hide skip objects with same definition, and what it basically says, well, the only thing that has been changed is the adding of a new measure, which is it also shows you what was changed. So this measure has been added. I like it because this is exactly what I want. Validate selection. This is what we will do, and I can generate a script. And this script is exactly what I am talking about. XML for analysis services, which is ironically JSON actually, but it used to be XML. We can save it, override my data model, and now if I go to Visual Studio Code, I will be able to deploy those two changes, or to not deploy, but commit those two changes to my source control. Edit a new measure, and let's push that change. Or first commit it, of course. All right, we have committed it now. It's actually still syncing, but let's go back to DevOps. And let's see the last commit, add a new measure. And we'll see the pbit has changed, but yeah, you cannot really see the difference because it's actually a zip file. But the XMLA has changed, and you can see some differences. For example, here you'll see a new measure, and now your colleagues can actually see what you changed, and now it's actually very clear and transparent what was changed with this commit. There's also some other things that have changed, which is very interesting, and that's something that I will still see sometimes. So not sure why the calculated year went from unknown to integer, but I'm not against it. So sometimes these things happen, which is also interesting. But now you have more idea of what was changed actually. If I just deployed it manually, I wouldn't know that these data types had actually changed. So that's interesting. But how can we deploy it? Because now I have just checked it in source control, but I have not actually deployed it just yet. I've created a couple of PowerShell scripts, which I will put on GitHub later, and at the end of the I'll put it on GitHub later, which is exactly what I will do. I haven't done that yet, but I will post them under this video. So deploy it. Let's do that. If we go back to Power BI, to the workspace for development, it'll be the old version. Let me just delete this report as well. So when I'll show you how to deploy a report, you can also see that will work. All right, so how do we deploy it? There are a couple of PowerShell scripts that I created. And please note, I'm not a PowerShell expert, so it may not be perfect, which is exactly why I will upload it to GitHub, so that someone who is very good or very well skilled with PowerShell can create a better version. But I got it working, which was something I was already really happy with. So this is a script that will deploy a model. It's actually based on the SQL Server PowerShell API. You'll see it in here. I will use the invoke ASCMD, which is a SQL Server PowerShell function, basically an analysis services PowerShell function. So if you work with Power BI Premium, you can actually connect to it as if it is analysis services, and we can deploy an analysis services model, exactly the same way as you would normally do. The only thing is that the server name will be like this, Power BI API, and then eventually you'll have the workspace name that this method will accept. I also will use a service principal, an API ID, and an API key, which I will retrieve from a key vault. So basically I go to the key vault, get my secrets, and then I'll call this function for, where is the workspace name, for development and later for production. So normally you would probably build a YAML file to release it independently, but I'm just demoing the script right now. What is a dev database server? What is the database server we're using now? So in this example, I only have one database server. I don't have a different one for development and production, but you could change it and it would actually replace those server names. So what does this script do? It basically replaces the dev database name with the new database name, the dev database server with the new database server. And later on you could actually change that. For example, you could also use a parameter in Power BI, of course. But, well, I'm still using this method, but that's one of the things I'm hoping to improve on later. And what it basically does is it'll look up the XMLA file for your model. You give a model location where that file is located, and it will basically call the analysis services API and deploy it. So let's run it. I've now created a new XMLA file. So if I run this, we should be able to see that the new measure has been added to the model. Alright, it's done. Let's see if it has actually worked. Let's try and create a new report from this data model. And in dim products, I'm now expecting amount of black products, and it's there. So we know it has deployed it, which is really good news. So deployment is actually kind of easy. I didn't think this was very hard. In this case, we're just using the analysis services deployment scripts. What was difficult, however, was to set the credentials and, for example, to refresh the model. So I had to delve kind of deep into the API to be able to do that. Another one is to refresh the model, which is also something I like to do via the analysis services API. So this is actually the SQL Server API, but it's an analysis services function, because you can just run any XMLA command to Power BI Premium. For example, the command to refresh it, which is basically XMLA like this. So you say, I want to refresh it fully, and I want to do this for the following database, which is the AdventureWorks cube in Premium. So the funny thing about this is that with premium capacity, you get the possibility to refresh up to 48 times a day. But if you use this method, you can do it as often as you like. So that's a funny workaround. If you want to do it more often, you have to basically treat it as if it is analysis services. And the rest of the function is basically the same. I retrieve the secrets, and then I call this function. We can see if this works by running it right now. Let's see if this, we can see in the service when it was refreshed. And it should be around 3:30 p.m. for today. Let's see if it does that. All right, so it's done. So if you go back to the workspace, I should now be able to see, yes, it was just refreshed. And which is also really cool that it works just like that. I think that's very handy if you want to refresh it more than 48 times. This is a great way. And you can also call this script, of course, with Azure Data Factory, for example. So if you refresh your data mart, you want to automatically refresh your Power BI model as well, of course. So with this scripting option, you can just refresh it anytime, for example, your data mart has been loaded, which is very interesting if you see it from a data platform perspective. All right, so if you look at the data set, and if I look at settings, you'll see that now it has been configured by Power BI API features, which is a service principal. And but now the real question is, how is it going to the data source, the underlying data source, which is Azure Synapse. Actually, it's a dedicated SQL pool. Well, this is a cloud source. So here it was funny. At first, I wanted to use a service account to go to the underlying data source. I wanted to do it with the service principal, but I couldn't get that to work. So eventually we wanted to use a SQL user, SQL login, and I asked Microsoft, how can I programmatically set credential? Because you can do it in XMLA, but the funny thing was that Power BI somehow seemed to ignore those credentials in the XMLA. I'm not 100% sure, but I think for analysis services in the cloud, this is possible because you can actually script it in XMLA, but the Power BI service just completely ignores that, which I thought was kind of frustrating. So I asked Microsoft, how can you do it? And they basically said, well, it's not possible because you have to use the gateway API, and there's no gateway for cloud sources. But I kept on trying, and funny enough, I actually figured out that if you use Synapse or Azure SQL, that programmatically there is a gateway ID. And I tried to use that API, and it actually works. So before I asked other Power BI MVPs, and they said, well, basically we just use our own credentials, which basically means that if you leave a company, that data model, when your account doesn't work anymore, or if your password changes, then that data model cannot be refreshed anymore, which I don't think is really acceptable for a professional data platform. So here, this is by my knowledge the only way to do it. Is it? Well, this is an interesting question. Is it supported behavior? I think so, because I use the API. But I think it's probably a conscious choice to have a gateway API for cloud sources. But it's really, well, it's the only way it works, right? So if we cannot use this anymore, we have to go back to manually setting credentials anyway. So this is the way it works, and I use the APIs, so in my knowledge, and I asked around at Microsoft, and they basically said, yeah, we think it's supported. So how does it work? Let's open the script. The set credential. It basically uses the Power BI REST method. So now we use a different API, the Power BI REST API. And what you basically have to do, first of all, we connect with the service account. Then I get the data sets in that workspace. And if it is I loop through it, and if it is the data set that we also provided in the parameter, then we have that data set. And then I ask for that data set to get the gateway information. And the gateway information, we convert it, and now we actually have a way to talk through that gateway with the REST API. With an post method, well, actually a patch method, we can basically set credentials with this body in the HTTP. So I provide the username, the database user, and the database password. And obviously, I have put those in the key vault, and I retrieve them via the Azure Key Vault. And I provide them to this function. And then we have to do two things. First of all, we have to take over this data set with the service account, because otherwise you cannot set a credential. For example, if you take over someone else's data set, it will say, are you sure? Because you're going to delete the credentials that are already there. So we have to take it over with the service principal. And then I do something, well, this is probably kind of strange. I give a sleep command for 3 seconds, because I seem to notice sometimes, not always, but sometimes, if I don't do this, then the second method fails, which is actually setting the credential. And I have reasoned that sometimes there seems to be a delay between taking over the data set and then actually calling the next method. And I suppose that underwater it's still registering that I have taken over the data set. So if you sleep for 3 seconds, then it will always work. And since then I haven't seen anything going wrong. So well, we can test this. For example, I can take over the data set. So it will, like I said, when you take over the data set, you need to provide new credentials. So I'll take it over. Then it cannot refresh it because the credentials are invalid. Please update your credentials and try again. So we can now test this script. I run it for at this moment only for the production workspace, but let's also set it for, let's test it also for the development workspace. See if that works. The underlying data source in this case is the same, so it shouldn't matter. I'm not running it from Windows PowerShell because there's some weird error at this moment at my local laptop. And as I said, I'm not a PowerShell expert, so I have to run it from PowerShell core. But normally you would run this from the cloud, from the DevOps, so it shouldn't be a problem. But this one I have to run from PowerShell core. And let's do it. Set credential. So let's run the script, set credential. Have to log in. So it said that it is done, so we can go back to the workspace. And if I go back to settings, you'll notice that the Power BI API has taken over the dataset again. Now we have to test one thing: can we still refresh it? And it was succeeded, so now we know it was able to do it. We can also check this, of course, if you go to the dedicated SQL pool, that is the source for this one under query activity. We should be able to see that it has refreshed it with the SQL admin user, which is used by Power BI to actually go to the data source. So you'll see I set the credentials with this one, with this SQL user, and now we actually are able to refresh the data model. So this is the setting of the credential. So how do we go about reporting? Well, for example, I like to create reports that are separated from the model. So for example, let's try. I have a report here, AdventureWorks, and I don't create reports with their own data model, so this one is connected to the data model in one of the workspaces. So let's see how that works. So let's transform the data. I want to use the data in the development workspace. And now you have a data model which is set here, and I have a report, but it doesn't have its own data model. It's an empty file basically. So let's update this report. Let's add a graph, and for example show the color here instead of the, well, we can put it on legend. All right, let's save this report. So you'll notice this report doesn't have a lot of data, doesn't have a lot of size, because the data is stored in the data model in the cloud. It's already published. So how can we then deploy reports automatically? I created a reports.json. And in that file is a list of files that I want to deploy. So for example, I say AdventureWorks PBX file, I want to deploy that. This is the name it should have in the service. And this is the workspace I want to deploy it to. Without a prefix, by the way. And this is the data set that you should bind it to. And I can use this script to deploy it over all the workspaces if I would like, over all the development, acceptance, if you have that, and to production workspace. And let me show the script. So in this one, I also use the Power BI REST API, so I have to use the PowerShell core for this one. So the first thing is still the same, right? I get the service principal. And I go through the path where the reports are located. And I also open the reports with JSON. And then what I basically do is I retrieve the Power BI workspace. And if the file matches the file in the JSON list, so then we do a couple of things. For example, first I delete the report just to be sure that it's deployed correctly. Sometimes you'll see that, for example, what I had is that now we develop the report with the connection to the dev workspace. For example, if I publish that report to the production workspace, it will still be binded to the data set in my dev workspace. And if I publish it, it will not recognize that the report already exists. So it will then deploy it next to the existing report. So what I first do is just remove that report altogether, and then we can deploy it. And at first we then deploy it, right? Oh, that's actually the second action, even if I say create or override, basically because we're deploying it with a connection to the dev workspace, it will not override it. It will just put it next to it. So that's why I first delete the report. And then there's the second or the last thing we need to do, which is to bind that report to the AdventureWorks dataset in the production workspace, or at least to the workspace we're deploying to. So what we basically do, we iterate over the datasets, and if the dataset name is the same, we retrieve it, and then we have to call this function to rebind it to the new dataset ID. So what I basically do is I look up the dataset ID for the same for the dataset that we specified in this JSON. So what we do is we deploy it to workspace, and then we say if you find a dataset with this name in that workspace, you have to bind the report again to this dataset, because obviously when we deploy it to production. So you'll see if I develop a report, of course, connected to the development workspace, but when I deploy it, I want it to be bound to the AdventureWorks dataset in the production workspace. So that's what we do in the script. So let's see if it works. Deploy reports. And now there should be a report in this workspace. There it is. And there's my report, which is actually updated. If you look at the lineage, it should be still be all right. Okay, so you have the AdventureWorks dataset in this workspace, and AdventureWorks here. Looks all right. But how does it look in production? We also have this report. Also looks very good. But what is the lineage? And we see it is bound to the AdventureWorks dataset in this workspace. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. And I hope to see you next time.